Hello, this is Tony Blazer back with another video for the Motocross Vault, and what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to take a look back at the very first issue of Racer X. I have every issue of Racer X coming back to the very first one. I was a subscriber when it first came out. Love this magazine, still love it, still subscribe today. This magazine was started in 1998 by Davey Coombs, Eric Johnson, and Chris Haltner. Davey Coombs, obviously, you know him. He's still behind the magazine now, also one of the driving forces between the Motocross Nationals and MX Sports. His father, Dave Coombs Sr., was one of the guys who had promoted races in the early days of motocross, had been behind events like Loretta Lynn's, also High Point Raceway, Steel City back in the day. In 1998, this was a really different kind of a magazine. Certainly much more different than like a Dirt Bike or Motocross Action, which were certainly the prevalent, most popular magazines at the time, Dirt Rider, things like that. It was much more like a kind of a Inside Motocross, which if you'd seen some of the other videos on my channel, you'll know Inside Motocross was a really influential magazine that had come out in the early 90s, only made 4 issues, but it was much more about the lifestyle of the sport than the actual races. And Racer X is very similar, certainly in spirit, to that Inside Motocross kind of ethos. This first couple of issues here are interesting to look back at. They really were only a couple of guys doing everything. I think Davey and Eric wrote everything in the first couple of issues. Chris Haltner was a very important photographer at the time. He had done a lot of work for Motocross Action in the early 90s, and these early Racer X's are cool to look back at now, and it's amazing to think how long ago this was. It's, over 20 years ago, so time flies. Certainly pretty interesting. I also looked back at Dirt Bike Magazine's first issue last month, so if you like this kind of thing, make sure you check that as well, and I'll keep doing these if people keep giving me some good feedback on them. So if you like this sort of thing, check out the other videos on the channel. Like I said, I've done a couple of magazines, done a lot of classic bike reviews. I just did one for the history of the CR80 and 80R. So make sure you subscribe. If you could share it, like it, comment, I would really appreciate it. It helps grow the channel. So here is the very first issue of Racer X Illustrated. All right, here on the cover we have the great Jeremy McGrath. This cover was from Bercy that year. Jeremy, if you know your history, was just coming off a pretty rough year on Suzuki's. It certainly was pretty lackluster by his standards. By most people, they would have been pretty happy with it. He almost won the Supercross title in spite of having a pretty lackluster bike and a couple of tough breaks during the year. But at the end of the year, he had gotten off Suzuki's and jumped over to Yamaha, and this was one of the first photos of him on a Yamaha. He had, I think, raced one race in England, and then this was Bercy here before the 98 season. So Davey decided to go with this awesome photo of Jeremy for the cover. Now, prior to the actual start of Racer X Illustrated in its current form, the magazine did exist in like a kind of like a cycle news format, like a newspaper. I think it was originally called the Racing Paper. I actually never had any of these early ones. It was kind of off my radar. I subscribed to all the other magazines, but I did not have Racer X. But you can see it here. This is the original one. It's, as I said, it wasn't on glossy paper or anything. It was much more like a newspaper, like the original Cycle News was. Now, when Davey decided to start Racer X, there's a great podcast that Mathis did a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, on the history of Racer X Illustrated and how the magazine got started. And it's really interesting. It's good to go back and listen to. But the major gist of it was David actually approached several different people about trying to partner with the magazine. He'd gone to see Jim Hale, who had been at the man behind Inside Motocross, which I had mentioned earlier. And Jim had a bad experience. Inside Motocross, the reason it only lasted 4 issues is because companies like High Torque, Jody over at MXA and stuff had issues with them advertising Axo Sport products in MXA and then having a magazine backed by Axo. Kind of thought that was a conflict of interest. So Jim was not interested in getting involved in that. Apparently Davey had gone to like Lou Seals, the guy behind Motor World, and several other people, and wasn't able to find any major backing. So they kind of did it on a shoestring budget here. As I said, the driving force between the first couple issues here is Davey himself and then Eric Johnson, who actually had a full-time job. I'm not sure where he was working in 1998. Currently he works for Monster Energy, I believe. But Eric was obviously had quite a vision for stories and stuff, and he's really some of his early work here is really, really inspirational to me, and I love it. There's some great stuff. There's a great one you'll see here later in this one, and several others that Eric did early on in the magazine that really kind of set the tone for what Racer X Illustrated was going to be moving forward. Alright, as we get into the magazine here on the inside cover, we have an ad for the latest Terra Firma, which in this case would be Terra Firma 4. This one, I don't really remember much about it. I got to remember, I love the Terra Firma movies. The first one was very, very influential in terms of getting other people within the industry to do motocross videos in the early 90s. The second one is probably my favorite. 2 and 3 are awesome. 4, I don't really remember much about it. I have them all. I have them all on VHS, and then I have the DVD that Fox put out, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s with the whole collection on it. But definitely super influential movies at the time. On pages 4 and 5, we have the table of contents, of course, with a really cool shot of Brock Glover, David Bailey, and Ron Lachine from 1986. Some random model, I don't know who that is off the top of my head. Mike LaRocco, a little article on him later in the magazine. On the right here, we have an ad for No Fear's Knack Knack sneaker. I never had a pair of these. I would love to have had a set. They were definitely very cool. I assume you probably got them at motorcycle dealerships, but at least none of the ones around here in Virginia seem to have them. Like I said, I never saw a set of them. I was stuck wearing Nikes or Reeboks or whatever the hell this stuff was at the time. I wasn't nearly cool enough to have a set of Jeremy McGrath sneakers. No Fear at this point was still a year away from breaking into the motocross gear industry. They had been like a lifestyle brand, I guess you'd say, for most of the 90s. You saw the stickers everywhere. No Fear stickers were super popular. You see them on the back of trucks and what have you, and t-shirts, hats, and stuff like that. In 99, though, they kind of came out with their own gear line with Jeremy McGrath, Sebastian Tortelli kind of highlighting it. I didn't love the stuff the first year, but after 99 and 2000, 2001, it's like my favorite stuff. I love it. Some of my all-time, maybe up there with like the early 90s Axo stuff and late 80s Fox stuff is my all-time favorite gear. That 2001 No Fear was just awesome. On page 6, we get Davey Coombs' first Reason for Being column. In this one, he talks about the kind of the bold choice to enter the magazine market at this time and how they've been planning on it for quite a long time. You got to figure in 1998, there's a pretty crowded field. You had Dirt Bike, you had Motocross Action, you had Dirt Rider, you had Motocross Journal, you had, I think, even MX Racer at this point, which was Don Maeda's publication, one of my favorites. And so Davey was pretty brave to come into this market. It's interesting, though, that they were going for a very different type of a magazine. As I'd said earlier, this Racer X clearly is kind of the same feel as the original Inside Motocross. I think Motocross Journal was also going sort of for this kind of same idea, that more of a lifestyle magazine than race coverage. At the time, you had Motocross Action and stuff doing race coverage, which ironically they don't do anymore hardly at all. They don't even go to the races. But back then, the internet was just starting to become kind of a thing, and you would have seen race coverage in the magazines, even though it was 2 or 3 months old. A couple interesting things here. Davey talks about the fact that the sport was going mainstream and how big it was becoming, corporate sponsors coming into the sport and everything. And in some ways, it's almost the same or maybe even worse now. You don't see the mainstream stuff like EA Sports and some of the other big players that were coming in the late 90s, early 2000s. If it wasn't for the energy drinks, you really wouldn't have hardly any outside sponsorship in the sport now. So it's kind of, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I don't know if it's better or worse. If you look at the editors here, Davey, like I said, was Davey and Eric Johnson. I think they pretty much wrote everything in this first issue. Chris Haltner, like I said, was doing a lot of the photography, and he was, I think, working at Fox Racing right before, or maybe even concurrently to this. I think the art design, even though it says Art Core Designs, I think Mark Blanchard, the gentleman behind like One Industries and was one of the artists at JT Racing and currently 100% Goggles, I think did a lot of the art design for this, kind of as a side project, just to help Davey out. And maybe that was the name of his company at the time, because I don't see him here on the listed in there. And if you see Fran Kuhn, who was senior photographer listed, he was one of the guys behind the original Inside Motocross. So clearly a lot of the same roots and ideas and stuff were the DNA of the new Racer X. Could trace itself back to the original Inside Motocross for sure. On page 7, we have an ad for Extreme Motocross gear. I loved Extreme. Extreme was a really cool brand there in the mid-90s. They had some really good-looking stuff. The gear in this ad, I'm not a fan of. I didn't care for the baggy look at all. I was never on board with that. I always thought it was terrible, but I will say I do like the model, quite honestly. There's one thing you will notice here, it's interesting. Motocross Action would never put an ad like this in here. So you saw, MX Racer, Racer X, they would do these ads, O'Neill ads with models and stuff in bathing suits and what have you. Clearly appealing to the young men and all of us. Motocross Action was always kind of going for I think Roland Hines was a pretty religious guy, or maybe it's Jody, I'm not sure. But in any case, they never had like scantily clad models or cigarette ads or any of that stuff in those magazines. So magazine ad like this that Extreme did, congratulating them on the first issue, you're just not going to see that in one of the other major magazines. Pages 7 and 8 here, you have an ad with Jeff Emig for Alpine Star, talking about how they had captured all the major AMA titles in 1997, I guess this would have been. This is an early 98 magazine, but talking about the 97 year. At this point, Alpine Stars wasn't doing gear, at least here in the U.S. They may have been available in Europe, but I always loved Alpine Star stuff. I hate the gear now. The gear is hideous in my opinion, but I love their boots. My all-time favorite boots for sure. And this was kind of a boring ad, but, I do like Alpine Stars products anyway. On page 10, we get the mailroom column. I find this interesting in that I guess when they're talking about all these issues, they must be referring to the old magazine, because obviously this being the first issue, there wouldn't have been, previous issues of the glossy Racer X in any case. A couple of interesting tidbits. There's a letter here from Rick Seaman, formerly known as Super Hunky, talking about how much he digs the magazine and its sense of humor. There's an interesting thing about Diagnosis Murder, which I think was a TV show on CBS in the 90s, if I remember, where apparently they used a bunch of scenes from Krusty Demons of Dirt. I never saw this episode. I wish I had. I do remember the infamous Dukes of Hazzard episode where they had some guys running around on ATCs. I always thought that was pretty cool. And there was I think one episode of 21 Jump Street when I was in high school where they were riding around on maybe KDX 200s or something. But anyway, all of us motocross nerds and stuff were always super keen anytime they showed some motocross stuff on mainstream television. On the right here we have a ad for Smith's new Trickstar goggles. I always loved Smith goggles. I always ran them because they would fit over my glasses. I wear glasses, as you can see at the beginning of the video here, and it was always hard for me to find goggles that fit over them comfortably. Oakley's, even the over glasses Oakley's would never really fit comfortably over them. I was pretty much stuck with either Scott or Smith. That said, I've never seen the Trickstar. I don't remember these goggles, and I never had a set. Maybe they were just for freestyle guys who like to set themselves on fire. On page 12 and 13 here, we have some interesting little nuggets of information. Remember what I said earlier about the mainstream, industry involvement in the sport? You can see here Mazda was a big sponsor of the Chaparral team, which was Jeremy McGrath's team in the time. And when you think about it, you also had Chevy Trucks, which was heavily involved in the sport, maybe in 2000 or so. Became like Kawasaki sponsor. So you just don't see heavy hitters like that much anymore. I know for a while Toyota even was involved in the sport, and you really don't see them except maybe as a minor sponsor of JGR. So in a lot of ways, like I said, if it wasn't for Monster, we'd be in tough times here. Another little interesting thing, they had a picture of Jeff Ward down below. This is from the JT article that appears later in the magazine. And Jeff Ward, when he was contemplating whether he was going to stay with Kawasaki, actually had a brief flirtation with Honda there. And JT took these photos in anticipation of his switch to Honda. It didn't actually go through, but it's a really cool little piece of motocross history that kind of what would have been or what could have been there. In the upper right here on page 13, you have a couple of very interesting sites you can try to go to now. I tried a couple. Some of them are still working, some aren't. It's interesting to me that Racer X Illustrated was actually around in 1998. I don't remember the website. Back then, I did go to it. I don't recall, to be honest. I was on the internet in 1998, but I was much more likely to go to motonews.com, which, if you're not familiar with Moto News, it really was a hugely influential, kind of message board early in the sport, kind of like what Vital MX is today. Vital MX basically took the place of Moto News. Moto News was Vital before Vital was Vital. I used to have Steve Brune there, the Factory Spectator, and that was the place you'd go to have your flame wars and talk shit on everybody and stuff. It was a great site for a long time, and then something went completely downhill in the mid-2000s. They started making you actually pay to use the site and stuff, and it's not around anymore if you go there. But it's cool that Racer X was around then, and I think, the ones that I see here I know are still there. AMA is still there. MX Large is still around, of course, Racer X. I doubt some of these others are still in existence. And the bottom right, you have an interesting photo here of Ricky Carmichael whipping his Kawasaki in '97. I think it says it was taken at the Pontiac Supercross. This was they did a actual billboard here of the photo, and then apparently Oakley wasn't sure who even shot it. I think Brett Smith over at We Went Fast did a giveaway recently. I think pretty much that was who I saw doing it on this photo. I didn't really remember this photo, but apparently it was a big deal in 1998. Here on pages 14 and 15, we have some really interesting information. Up at the upper left here, you have Jeff Emig being named the 1997 Rider of the Year. Jeff had an amazing year in '97, winning the outdoor title and his one and only Supercross title. Clearly the highlight of his career, because it didn't go as well after this. '97 was kind of great, and then '98 was decent. '99, off the rails. Definitely a tough year. Right to the right of that, you're going to see a little section called Electronica. Now that's interesting. It's talking about the Grand Prix going to electronic scoring. You have to remember back in the old days, it'd be like a local race where you'd have like scoring ladies and it'd be taking down your number every lap. So we didn't have the transponders yet. So for 1998, they were going to the transponders in Europe. This was a great idea, and certainly one that eventually they're talking about the AMA wanting to implement, although they're saying they were a little concerned because it would cost $100,000. That's some really expensive transponders. The only thing I didn't like about this was when they went to this in the GPs, they stopped putting their numbers on the side. Maybe call me old school, but I thought it was stupid. You couldn't tell who the hell anybody was if you saw them from the side. And I just never thought it looked cool. I'm a traditionalist, and I never cared for this whole sponsor on the side of the bike look, although certainly for the sponsors it was a good idea. Another little interesting tidbit here on the CC section where they're talking about different numbers in the sport. The second one down where it's talking about 1 million hits on the Cycle News virtual grandstand. Now again, if you're young, didn't grow up in this era, you wouldn't remember this, but back in the mid to late 90s, Cycle News had a thing called the virtual grandstand, and what it would do is basically like live tweeting would be now of the event. It would be telling you what's happening. So for instance, when Doug Henry won the 1997 Las Vegas Supercross on a four-stroke, none of us watched it live unless you were at the event. I listened on my computer. I was actually not listening. I was watching it on my computer in the virtual grandstand. Same thing when Damon Bradshaw won High Point in '97. I was watching it happen. The guy, somebody at Cycle News is typing it out, essentially, like I said, live tweeting of its day. And this is the way you got. This was a real revolution, because before that you had to call like 1-900-INF Moto, or you'd have to wait till like a week or so till Cycle News came out. So when Cycle News did this, man, it was really, really a cool thing that I loved. Like I said, it was the only way to find out what was happening, up close and personal as it was happening. In the bottom right here, you have a little blurb on Pedro Gonzalez, I believe it is, number 24. Looks like, Pedro, I think, riding for the, I don't know, what is it, the Tecate Beer, that's who it is, Tecate Beer team. And to the left, there's a little thing talking about called the pitch. It's kind of similar to what I do with I do a column called Classic Inc. at pulpmx.com now, where I look at some of the classic ads. And this one, they were looking back at some of the classic ads back. And this one's for the 1979 YZs. Really, really iconic ad with Rick Burgett and Bob Hanna and Brock Glover all running the number one place from the championships they won in '78. Really, really cool ad, and definitely one of the most memorable of any era. On pages 16 and 17, we have an ad for Zing Graphics, which I don't remember at all. It certainly didn't make much of an impression on me. I don't remember it now. On pages 18 and 19, we have a update on some preseason races. This first one here on page 18 took place at Glen Helen and had a pretty scary moment where apparently Jeff Emig cartwheeled his KX into a fence. Jeremy McGrath took his new Yamaha to his first win for the brand in America. He'd already won some events overseas at Paris and I think, like I said, Sherwood maybe, if I remember right. On the right here, you have an ad for Honda celebrating its 50th anniversary. And on page 20, we have another update on some preseason racing. This one was at the Paris Raceway, which used to have, I think Goat Brecker used to put on a preseason race that was a pretty big deal back in the 90s. This one was won by Sebastian Tortelli, who many people here in the U.S. probably hadn't heard much of at this point. He was already a world champion in the 125 class, and I think he would go on to win the 250s this year. I think this is the year he won the 250s. Sebastian, though, his speed was legit. He would actually come out here and put it to the Americans at this preseason race, and then, as you'll see a little later in the issue, come out and win the first race of the year, which turned out to be a fluke in hindsight, but at the time, man, it was really, really shocking that this Euro came here and put it to us. So at the time, the Europeans were thought of as being, still a tick behind America. America had won many, 13, 14 motocross destinations in a row. And although we'd had a rough run in 94, 95, we'd come back in 96. And it was certainly not feeling that the Europeans were going to take the sport back from us at this point. But Tortelli seemed to be, a new wave of some really fast Euros that were on their way over here. And then on the next page, we have a ad with Jeff Emming for Arnett goggles, or actually this is Arnett glasses. I never had a pair of Arnett glasses or goggles. Wearing glasses myself, I never could wear the cool Oakley blades or any of that stuff. I was stuck with prescription stuff, so this ad didn't mean a whole lot to me. On pages 22 and 23, you get a look at a couple of things that have stood this test of time and are still in the magazine, and a couple of things that have not. The Buzz column here in the lower left in page 22 is still in the magazine. Every month they give you an idea of what's trending up, what's trending down in the sport. In 1998, it was the new Supercross series was trending up. Sean Palmer, if you remember, was an extreme sports athlete. X Games, I think the X Games were around at this point. Yeah, they were. France was trending up, the Outdoor Nationals. In the upper left, you see the Evil update. For some reason, Davey Coombs had some obsession with Evel Knievel. I was never an Evel Knievel fan. In fact, my dad hated him so much he wouldn't even let me have Evel Knievel toys, which is a story for another day. I have no idea why my dad hated Evel Knievel, but he did. So the whole Evil thing was never to my interest to any great extent. But early on, they were always tracking down Evel Knievel for some odd reason. On the right-hand side on page 23, you have the Aspiring Models Club. I don't remember how long this happened. This is kind of like, again, you're going to see more of this stuff early on. It kind of went the wayside like Don Maeda's mullet watch and stuff. But it is interesting to look at some stuff like this Buzz and then the earlier CCs and the later Noise column section where they kind of take quotes of everybody, how they have been in the magazine from the very beginning and are still in there even today. I am not sure how much longer they're going to be around. I would have to log this ad for Suzuki. Suzuki is a great historic brand, the earliest brand really to become successful in motocross, winning world championships starting in 1970 or so. And it is really tough to watch what's happening with Suzuki. I understand that they just are leased out their Supercross track to Honda and stuff, so it's not looking good. They're pulling out of international racing, AMA racing every which way to Sunday, so you have to wonder how much longer they're going to be around. But I had several RMs in the 90s. Some I liked, some I didn't. But it's just sad to see a brand like them kind of be in such tough times. So here's hoping that Suzuki pulls things around going forward. Now, on the next page, on page 26, we have the very first edition of Ask Rhino. Or if you know anything about Ryan Hughes, he is an extremely interesting guy. Really one of a kind. Certainly has no lack of opinions. He has all the opinions. And it was kind of cool that Davey was able to get Rhino to do this column where you could write in and ask him questions. Now, one interesting bit of information, I was actually talking to Jason Wygant today about this issue, telling him I was doing a rewatch, or not a rewatch, but like a look back at the magazine. And he mentioned that in this very first Ask Rhino column, the last two questions are actually both from him. They don't say Jason Wygant. For some reason, it says Jason Rowan in New Jersey. I don't know if he was writing under a pseudonym or Davey decided to do this for some reason. I don't know. But the last Rhino question and the last question for Leanne Tweeden, who we'll get to in a little bit, were both by Jason Wygant, who was apparently in school at this point, was not affiliated with the magazine at all. And he said he was super pumped to get him in the magazine, even though they were under I don't know. Maybe that was his flagger name. Jason Rowan was his top secret flagger name back at back in Jersey. Opposite Rhino's column, we have an ad for Zing Graphics and Seth Enslow. Now, to Seth Enslow's credit, this is a guy who took 5 seconds of crashing fame in the original Crested Demons and Dirt and turned it into a bit of a career in the 90s. I remember the kind of the joke was, is Seth dead after his many crashes? If I remember right, he turned into a bit of a stunt rider and wadded it pretty bad in the early 2000s, jacked his head up, had a bunch of staples and stuff in his head. I do remember these graphics with the kind of a Evel Knievel flair to them. Although in my memory, I thought they were One Industries did them, but apparently this was Zing. So maybe I remember Zing more than I remember. I thought I did. If you would have asked me Zing Graphics, I couldn't have pulled it out of my rear end. But apparently they were affiliated with Seth there for a little while. He must have went to One right after this, so maybe Zing went under. I'm not sure. Maybe if anybody out there knows, let me know. Is like I said, a special edition version here that's on the next page with Leanne Tweeden's column. Decent looking stuff. This early 97 CR, in my personal opinion, looked better just with the stock stuff. The 97 CR is a really good looking bike and didn't really help it to put this Seth Enslow stuff on it. But, I'm sure some people dug it and bought it. Now, on the left here, as I mentioned, there's Leanne Tweeden. Now, these days, Leanne Tweeden is a bit of a controversial character, not to get political, but she's probably best known as the lady who kind of took down Senator Al Franken. She was involved with him on some USO tours probably in the mid-2000s, I'm guessing. And famously, he had taken some pictures that were inappropriate and stirred up a bunch of stuff, and he ended up resigning. But Leanne was, quite a staple in the magazine here in the late 90s when it first started. She did her column was called Purr, and people would write in, and she would answer their questions if I remember right. Now, here's a little interesting side tidbit. Leanne is actually from where I live. She was born in Manassas, and she actually dated a friend of mine in high school. She's only a couple years younger than me. Looked a little different back then, but in any case, I haven't seen her in years. But Leanne, unfortunately, she'll probably be more infamously remembered for the Al Franken stuff than anything she did here in the magazine. But it was a real popular column here for a few years. On page 30, we get a column by Jeff Emig called Caffeine. Now, this column, in this first one at least, he's talking about his first Supercross of the year at the LA Coliseum. Emig was coming in as the reigning champ, had an all-new deal with Shift Racing. Talks a little bit about being the president of Shift Racing, which I don't remember him being the president. I don't know if that was a ceremonial thing. Shift is a division of Fox even now. And it was really, really great-looking stuff. I loved this Shift gear in 97. It looked great. But unfortunately, the most thing I remember about this column is, in my recollection, it got more and more uncomfortable as Emig's season went off the rails. A year later, he would end up losing his contract with Kawasaki. Kawasaki would fire him halfway through the year after being caught with marijuana paraphernalia at Lake Havasu, if I remember right. But early on here, it didn't look like the season was going to go sideways, so Emig was trying to put on a positive face after finishing second at the first round, which would unfortunately end up to be really the high point of his entire season. After that, it was all downhill. There's a Spy Racing ad here on the right. It's talking about the Pro Circuit guys being on Spy Racing. I don't remember that. Like, I know as far back as I can remember, Scott Racing was who all the guys at Pro Circuit used, but maybe back then when they had AXO gear and stuff, Spy was the sponsor. I just don't remember, to be honest. On page 32, we get EJ's column, A View from the Fence, and in it he answers the question I wasn't sure of earlier where he was working. Apparently it was at Ground Zero, which was an ad agency. As I'd said, EJ had a full-time job. He wasn't able to just quit that and work for Racer X full-time. He kind of did both, at least initially. I'm not sure how it went down the road, but this was a pretty shoestring operation initially, so he had to have a full-time job on the side at the very least. On the right here, we have a Dunlop tire ad. Dunlop continues to be the only brand, I guess. I guess Pirelli too, but when Bridgestone pulled that, Dunlop kind of pulled up the slack there. It's good to see them still sponsoring the teams and staying so involved in the sport. On the next page, we get an ad for Hypersports, which I did a little Google search and I came up with nothing for Hypersports in Colorado, which is where it shows here. So they may be out of business. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, so many companies have come and gone in 20 years. I remember seeing these ads all over the place. I don't think I ever actually ordered anything from them, but if they are gone, rest in peace. On the next page, we have an article by Eric Johnson covering the 1998 season opener from the LA Coliseum, a venue that I never got to attend. Never looked like the greatest place to watch a race. This is interesting, though, for 1998. They actually let them build the track on the infield. A lot of times they used to have to build the track around the outside alone and leave the grass in the center. So at least the track was a little better for 1998. But they had some mud, right before the race. It rained, and it was kind of a messy race. But this race is really interesting and unique for many reasons. Doug Henry, who was on a 1998 production version of the four-stroke this year, it was the first year of the production bike, almost won this race. And it's pretty amazing when you think that, if I remember, I don't think another four-stroke won a race after his 97 Las Vegas win until maybe Nathan Ramsey in 2002. I mean, it looked like after Las Vegas, and then he comes out here and almost wins this race on a production version, like the four-strokes are just going to take over Supercross. And then it didn't happen. It took quite a long time. I had this bike. I had a 99 version, which is almost identical. That thing was a handful on a tight track. It was really a cool bike in a lot of ways, but it was heavy as hell. It felt like an XR400 when you were riding it. Very heavy machine, but awesome motor. Really cool bike, but not made for Supercross. It had a wicked hiccup. If you whack the throttle, suddenly it would, kind of hiccup and try to die and nosedive. And it's pretty amazing Henry did as well on it as he did. The star, though, Henry led the race up until the very last lap. But the guy who stole the show was Sebastian Tortelli. He was coming in just basically, I think he raced the first 7 rounds this year. He was racing the GPs full-time in 98, planning on coming overseas in 99 for Supercross full-time. And he was riding a Kawasaki and ended up having a bad start. He got like a 15th place start on the first lap, came all the way back to pass Henry on the last lap and win the race. The real sad story of the night was Henry, right after Sebastian passed him on the last lap, he stalled that damn four-stroke and couldn't get it started. So he went from winning the race to, I don't know, he got 10th or something maybe at the end. It really sucked. Jeff Emig, who had been up front early kind of stalking Henry, wasn't able ever to make the pass, ended up having second handed to him when Henry had the problem with his motor. And then, if I remember right, Jeremy McGrath ended up getting third. So this first round, it was full of surprises. You had basically an unknown here in America, Sebastian Tortelli, coming out and winning it, much like his European counterpart. Actually, I guess you'd say his South African counterpart, Greg Albertine, had done the year before. Really surprised everybody that race, and then this one too. So Los Angeles, 2 years in a row, came out with some really surprising finishes to start the season. Now, before we go any farther, I have to mention this ad for JT Racing, which by 1998 was on the ropes. It was really, really kind of at the end of its line. The Gregories had become kind of disenchanted with the whole motocross thing. They'd started to hit it big in paintball, and I have no idea who the hell thought this ad was a good idea. I mean, it's just ridiculously stupid. Certainly wasn't going to sell any JT gear. I had some JT gear in the early, maybe 93, 94, and it fell apart. I was really disappointed in it, and I was like, well, I like the looks of it, but the quality just wasn't there anymore. And really disappointing and sad to see a historic brand kind of go down the toilet here at the end. On page 48 here, we get a subscription ad for Racer X with some random freestyle person I don't know who is. I was never much into freestyle, never really interested me that much. I respect their ability, but just wasn't my cup of tea. On the right here, you have an ad for Honda of Troy, which I believe still exists. I think it's just Honda Power Sports of Troy now. But in the 90s, Honda of Troy was a real powerful motocross team. It was kind of right up there with Pro Circuit, run by a gentleman by the name of Phil Alderton, who unfortunately has passed. The team was shut down around 04, 05, I think. I know Phil had some problems with drugs and some other issues that, unfortunately, I think kind of eventually led them to pull the team off the circuit. But as I said, I believe Honda Troy still exists. Starting on page 50, we get an article by Davey Coombs on Mike LaRocco. Now, Mike LaRocco was coming off probably the worst season of his career. He had made the switch from Kawasaki to Suzuki in 1996, and the 96 season had been okay. The 97 season, though, it actually just went off the rails. Mike had had some really high-profile run-ins with Roger DeCoster. At the time, LaRocco's dad was his mechanic. It had been his mechanic at Kawasaki as well, and there were some pretty infamous incidents where they had some disagreements with management and stuff. I think similarly they had some problems at Kawasaki. A lot of times you hear that where a kid has his dad as a mechanic, and there's always this kind of tug of war there, where obviously the mechanic and the father in this case is going to have allegiance to the kid before the team he's working for. So I think it causes some issues there. I'm not always sure people are capable of separating things and being clear-minded about stuff. So for 1998, Mike had switched teams. He actually had started a new team. If you look here, this is the first year for what is now the Geico Honda team. Factory Connection, at the time, Jack in the Box Honda was started here in 1998 as a team to kind of give Mike a second chance at salvaging his career, because he had taken it really on the chin in 98. I think he'd even sat out a race or two in protest with Suzuki. It was not a good situation. So he had went to Fred Bramblett, and Fred had helped set up a team for Mike using Rick Ziegfeld, I think is Ziegfelder, how you say it. Ziggy at Factory Connection had started a privateer team. Now this sponsorship here by Jack in the Box, I understand, is actually, they really didn't put anything into the team. It was more a thing where they gave the team a little legitimacy. I think it really just made the team look more professional than it probably was at first. This early iteration, they still were just kind of getting things on the rails. And Mike had a pretty good year in 98. He kind of revitalized his career. He made the switch from MSR as his gear sponsor to O'Neill this year. I think he felt that, it says here in the article, that MSR hiring Albie for 98 would have pushed him to the side and made him like no longer the top dog. And there's always a lot of ego in these kind of things, and he had decided he wanted to be the featured rider, so he went to O'Neill Racing. And this year, the O'Neill Racing is good-looking stuff, and this bike is pretty cool. Like I said, the 97, 98, 99 Hondas weren't the greatest bikes stock, but Mike had some pretty good success on it, and so did Ezra Lusk. So I think the Works bikes certainly were a lot better performance-wise than the stock machine was in these years. Interesting article, and certainly Mike was always one of my favorite riders, in spite of the fact that he was pretty stoic in general. Here we have an ad for Shift Racing with Jeff Emig. Shift was in its second year here in 98, and it had been started actually out of a disagreement between Jeff and Greg Fox. Greg had felt like, with the popularity of baggy gear and some of the more outlandish designs out there, he thought they should bring that to Fox, and Pete had thought that Fox should stay more core to motocross, not really go down the LBZ route. So the compromise had been Shift, and Emig was the perfect guy to rep the new brand. He had kind of a free-spirited attitude about racing, and certainly, at least his public persona was so. And Jeff was really, really, keen to push the envelope, and the Shift designs, things like leisure suits and this kind of bracelet here. It's certainly more almost like of a rapper kind of a vibe. It was a really cool brand then. It certainly had its ups and downs in the early 2000s. I think it took a bit of a turn for the worse, but in about 2011 or so, Chad Reed kind of brought it back to prominence. But Shift Racing, awesome brand now, certainly, and then was maybe one of the best looking stuff you could buy in 1998. On pages 58 and 59, we get a couple of ads. One on the left is for the Supercross series coming up in 98, and the one on the right is for 1-800-COLLECT, which, again, if you're young, you may or may not remember the whole idea of collect phones. In 98, almost none of us had cell phones. They were available, of course, but it was still not very common. A lot of people still used payphones. And if you were going to call somebody and it was outside of your local area code, you had to call collect, which was an extra charge. And the whole idea with 1-800-COLLECT was you could dial this number and save a little bit on the collect charges. I don't really know how that worked. I'm not sure, because you're still buying the time from the phone company. But anyway, in any case, it was a really popular sponsor of the sport, one of the outside sponsors that you just don't have now. And 1-800-COLLECT, they sponsored Ricky Carmichael here. Famously, they sponsored the Honda team during its heyday in the early 90s with McGrath and Stanton and Henry and all those guys. Definitely an icon of 90s motocross. Starting on page 60 with an article by Eric Johnson that, in my opinion, absolutely sets the tone for what the new Racer X Illustrated was going to be. Very much in the vein of Inside Motocross before it. We were going to tell long-form stories. We're going to tell interesting, in-depth stories about the history of the sport, the personalities in the sport, not about, what bike was the best in 1998 or anything like that, but the real core interest of the sport. You got to remember, in these days, there weren't podcasts like Mathis does. In Motocross Action, they might do a little bit of an article on JT Racing, but it's not going to be the same kind of like in-depth, rich story you get here in Racer X. Now, this story about JT Racing is awesome. I recommend reading it. I am going to post this PDF of this entire magazine to my website, themotocrossvault.com, so you can download it, read it. I'm not going to go through the whole thing and read it here for you. Obviously, it'd take too long, but I recommend taking the time to do it. Long story short, JT Racing was an absolute powerhouse in the 80s. They had all the greatest riders. You had guys like, Brock Glover, Rick Johnson, Donnie Hansen, Marty Smith, Johnny O'Mara. They even had Jeff Ward and, Ken Howerton there for a while in the brand. It was just a powerhouse. Now, eventually, of course, by the late 80s into the early 90s, JT was kind of on the decline, and by 1999, they were gone completely. So it was one of these things where they flashed really bright, kicked everybody's ass, and then, after some litigation issues, people suing them, and eventually, like I said, they had some success in the paintball industry. The Gregories decided to go a different direction, but for a little over a decade, JT Racing was the hot brand in motocross. Really, really iconic brand, and one of the pioneers in the sport in terms of style. Oh, LBZ baggy siding. Hated that stuff. JT, though, it's really, really worth going back and reading it. I did an article on Pulp MX as well, where I went through some of their iconic designs, told a little bit about the history of the sport. So if you'd like, check that out as well on the website. It's a good read if you, pardon me not saying so, or pardon me boasting a little bit. I think it's definitely worth checking out. JT, towards the end here, ended up with like Rick Johnson. Not their best days in my opinion, but they took some chances with JMB. Apparently that didn't sell the best. But in any case, the early days, the 80s, were great days for JT, and this is an amazing, amazing article. Up next, we have a page full of some ads here. Motion Pro always had some good stuff. I use that brake bleeder there. Calendars with hot ladies in it. Always a big fan of that. On the right here, you have a really cool ad, though, for Throttle Jockey. They were doing the factory Honda graphics at this point. They were a few years old. I think they started maybe 94, 93-ish, somewhere in that range, mid-90s. And they had really kind of grown in success really quickly, and they were doing the factory Honda stuff in, I believe, 1995 was the first year they did it. Then they switched to 100% for some reason in 96, but they were back in 98 here on the factory Honda squad. So that's Ezra Lutz's bike, looking very, very dapper indeed. On the next article up is another one by Davey Coombs. This one talking about the fast Frenchman in the sport. Although in 1998, they certainly had not won 5 motocross designations in a row, so they were blazing fast, but maybe not quite as successful on the international stage as they are now. You had guys like Jean-Michel Bale who had kind of broken through and broken that ceiling here for success in America. Really had shown us the fast way around a track there for a couple years before he went to road racing. But in 1998, you had a young bunch of up-and-comers, guys like Stefan Roncada, David Villeman, Sebastian Tortelli, we talked about earlier in the magazine. You had a couple of the older, European guys, Yves Demarié still over there, Frederic Vallet, Michael Massio, Frederic Bellet. A lot of really fast Frenchmen. It's interesting that maybe because the French actually raced Supercross, and they had a really cool, interesting farm system. I think that kids could actually go to school and take like motocross as a part of the curriculum, I think. Whatever was going on over there, it's always turned out some really fast guys and continues to do so. The French, if you're going to have like on the international stage, one country you'd say has really been able to keep pace with America, or at least be competitive in Supercross, it's definitely the French. So even in 1998, they were some of the fastest guys in the track. Here on this last page of the article, there is an interesting Race Tech ad here in the upper left, which is a little bit of a double entendre. I'm not sure you'd see that as well. They said, Race Tech knows what you want, we put out. Pretty funny little ad there for Race Tech indeed. Here on page 92, you have an ad for Applied Racing. Clamps are one of those interesting things that prior to the 90s, you did not see people swapping out clamps maybe they were available, but I never saw them available in the 80s. There was really kind of a thing where people started messing with the geometry. Really, in the 80s or the 70s, you would have seen people swapping out the shocks, and that became uncommon in the 90s. So the aftermarket industry switched to things like clamps and links to alter the handling of the motorcycle. And it was pretty cool that you could do that without having a factory machine. On the right here, you have an ad for the Husaberg FC600. Husaberg, if you're not real familiar with it, was the people behind the original Husqvarna. Husqvarna today is a Austrian company. It's really just KTM with white plastic. But in the 80s and prior, the previous 100 years, Husqvarna was a Swedish company. Now, when Husqvarna was sold to Cagiva in 1987, the guys who were the previous engineers in Sweden had decided to start their own company, take their four-stroke expertise, and they had been some of the pioneers in like racing four-strokes in the 80s, and start a company called Husaberg. Now, these bikes had really phenomenal performance for their time. Guys like Joel Smets had won world titles on them. I only ever saw one locally at the races one time, and we always thought the thing was just weird and cobby. I remember the brake rotor, one of our local pros was going through the whoops, and the brake rotor locked up the front wheel and cartwheeled him. The bikes were, if you got up close, they're kind of almost handmade. They didn't have the same qualities you would have found on like a little more of a mainstream bike. But they had some really innovative technology. If I remember correctly, KTM bought the company in like 97, 98. And they used it as the basis when they were trying to come out with their new racing four-stroke motor. So a lot of that design is owed back to Husaberg here. So the DNA of the modern KTM four-stroke in the early 2000s really was actually kind of a Husaberg design. So it's kind of interesting that KTM ended up having the Husqvarna name, and in the 90s they actually had taken the former Husqvarna engineers and kind of helped jumpstart their four-stroke racing development at the time. Up next, we have a few pages with some lovely ladies showing off some new motocross gear, and in this case, I guess looks like maybe a road race jacket. Leanne Tweeden, Shannon Dolly, and Heather Voss, who was Miss Supercross, I'm pretty sure even at this point in 1998. She was the sister of Heath Voss, who would go on to win the quote-unquote World Supercross title in around 2004, if I remember right. I don't know much about Heather. She was like the first Miss Supercross that I actually remember. Before that, it seemed like maybe I don't know if they had one or just like a rotating thing, but in the days before Diana Dahlgren and the current ones, that she was like the first one that I can really remember. Now, they did this article, or I don't know what you'd call it, this section where they had models and clothes for the first couple of issues. It's kind of similar. Don Maeda did something similar with his Dirt Girl stuff and MX Racer. It doesn't continue today. I'm not sure how many they did it. I looked at a couple issues, and they did it at least in the next issue as well. I seem to remember them going about it for a while, but eventually they got away from that. So this is one of those early things in the magazine that has not continued up to modern day. On page 106, we get the X-rated column by Davey Coombs. This is one that was in the early magazine. I don't think it's still in there. I could be wrong on that, but in this one they're talking about, Davey Coombs is writing about the plethora of movie premieres going on at the time. They had premieres for the new Terra Firma 4, you had Crusty Demons of Dirt 3, they had Steel Roots, which is a video I still have. I love that one. That's actually one of the classics. I do remember it's a great video by Jeremy McGrath. Some cool video of him on the Suzuki, the ill-fated Suzuki. This is a really interesting little tidbit here talking about all the guys going to the premieres. And on the next page there is some phenomenal photography. God bless America for these lovely ladies. Certainly looked like a great party to go to. I wish I had been invited. Unfortunately, I did not get the invite. It was lost in the mail. On page 108, we get an ad for MSR and Greg Albertine. As I mentioned earlier, Greg was switching from the hideous Biaffi gear to MSR in 1998. Huge improvement for Greg. He always looked goofy as hell to me in that Biaffi stuff. It made him look like a total Eurospode, and the switch to MSR was a huge upgrade in my opinion. There's an ad here for 911 on the lower right, which is one of the sponsors, I guess, of LaRocco in 98. I don't remember 911. I'm not sure what it was. On page 110, we get an interview with Larry Naston in the 5 Minutes With column. This one's by Davey Coombs. Interestingly, perhaps due to inflation, the magazine still has this column, but it's now the 10 Minutes With. So you know how things go up over time, so maybe they doubled it for that reason. Now this article talks about Larry's move from the motocross industry to calling NASCAR. This brings up the inevitable NASCAR envy, which has permeated the sport since at least the mid-90s, where everybody worships NASCAR like it's the Holy Grail. Never cared for circle track racing. I find it unbelievably boring. I don't understand the appeal. The only thing I can say is certainly a lot of people watch it, so I can understand having that envy, but you can keep everything else about that sport, from my opinion. But that's a story for another day. On page 112, we have another 5 minutes with. This time it's with Larry Brooks, and keeping with my previous statement that every article is written either by Eric Johnson or Davey Coombs, this time it's Eric Johnson. Now, Chaparral Racing had been in the sport in 96, I think, and 97 was the first year, but they were kind of a niche player. They weren't really a frontier team, but in 98, they scored the biggest coup in the sport by getting Jeremy McGrath when he was unhappy with his contract with Suzuki. After 1 year, he moved to Yamaha. He didn't go to factory Yamaha. He went to Chaparral Yamaha. So this was by far the biggest signing probably ever in terms of aftermarket teams. Jeremy was, still a really great rider. I think a lot of people maybe had a little doubt after how poorly he had ridden in the outdoors in 97, because I got to be honest, Supercross, he was pretty good. Outdoors, I remember watching him at Budds Creek. He got the whole shot in one of the motos and just started fading backwards like he was a mid-pack Spode. It was pretty painful to watch. Clearly, he wasn't happy with what was going on. So there really was a little bit of thought that maybe Jeremy, maybe his dominating days were over. So it wasn't like now you think of the Yamaha days and maybe they're even more dominant than they were here on the Hondas. But really, that was still in the future at this point. 98, you didn't know that was going to happen. And Larry talks a little bit with Eric about setting up the team and what they had to do to make it happen. Dave Dameron and Larry put in a lot of work, and a lot of sponsors for the team. It really was quite a amazing coup, and Jeremy would go on to kick some major ass for at least another 3 or 4 years on the Yamahas for the Chaparral team. So it was a huge signing, and Larry Brooks would go on to have quite a successful career as a team manager after that. He would go to, if I remember right, KTM, and then San Manuel later, and would have championships with Chad Reed and James Stewart. So quite a historic career for Larry, and this was really the beginning of that major success in 1998. On pages 13 and 14, we get some more ads. This one on the left here is pretty interesting. It's for Skin Industries, which was a graphics company. Did some, obviously you can see some apparel here and some motorcycle graphics in the late 90s. Definitely kind of the freestyle baggy clothes set. Not my cup of tea at all. These graphics here were called Lesbo's Kiss, if I remember right, which is probably wouldn't fly today. In any case, it certainly was a bold choice. Not really my cup of tea. I don't know how long Skin lasted. If I remember right, I think Skin was actually backed by some guy in the porn industry, I heard. But again, hearsay, not going to be any kind of expert on that. So just a little interesting tidbit to file away. On page 116, we have the deluxe section here, and this looks at some brand new merchandise available out there. The Big Gun exhaust there at the bottom kind of gives me a bit of a Dirt Girl vibe, which is maybe why this section I don't think stayed in the magazine. It's certainly not in there now. Who doesn't love a lovely lady with an exhaust pipe? But in any case, Big Gun was started by Mike Young, who had started it after he was paralyzed. And this was kind of his, the four strokes were a real good opportunity for certain people. Dr. D, Doug Dubach had started his company as well. So basically the influx of the four strokes really helped start some of these companies. And I think Big Gun's still around today. It's a cool little flask there on the left as well. Wouldn't mind having that. I'm sure Emig enjoyed that probably a few times too many in 99. On the right, we have an ad for Bar to Bar. I think this is for the 1997 Bar to Bar. I actually have this exact VHS on videotape, and you can find the race, this video on the Motocross Race Vault, which is my other channel if you want to check it out. It looks back at the complete 97 season. On the next page, we have an ad for Moose Racing, which I think actually was backed by Dave Burleson, Enduro champion. Moose Racing was a couple of years old at this point. It maybe started in the early 90s. Still around, still some popular gear in the off-road realm. On the next page, we have an ad for Burton Motorsports, which never heard of, don't remember Burton Motorsports, no idea if they're still around. And then we have an ad for Legacy, which is a VHS, another one that I do have. That's really great, actually. I don't think I have it on my YouTube, and you might be able to find it on YouTube. It looks back at like the legacy of the sport, some of the great heroes over the years. Really an interesting video and definitely worth checking out. The one thing you notice in this early version of the magazine is there's no two tribes. That is a staple of Racer X that did not start until issue 2. So this first issue doesn't have two tribes. But you look at issue 2, the one with Larry Ward on the cover, it has the two tribes, which still continues to this day. So that one didn't make the cut on issue 1. On the last page here, we have a tribute to Inside Motocross. As I said, the spirit of Racer X is clearly basically traces its DNA back to Inside Motocross, Fran Kuhn and Jim Hale's amazing magazine. In every issue, starting with issue 1 and currently today, they have a little tribute here to Inside Motocross. It has the exact font style of Inside Motocross at the top. The current one doesn't keep the exact kind of layout. It has more like a paragraph or something they talk about blur. But this first one here looks just like the original issue talking about. It basically looks like what issue 5 could have looked like. Really cool tribute and to one of the most awesome motocross magazines of all time. And here on the last page, we have an ad for the Men in Blue at Chaparral. And as I said, Jeremy McGrath had made the move over there, and then Jimmy Button was his teammate. Those two were close friends. Really cool poster. Actually, I wish I had this poster. It's really a great ad idea. Men in Black was the first Men in Black. It had just come out maybe a year before this, 96, 97, I think. And this is kind of a cool homage to that. Really dig that. And on the very back here, we have Renthal's cool ad touting Jeremy McGrath's new Yamaha ride number 2 for 1998. Would end up being number 1 at the end of the year. So there you have it. The very first issue of Racer X Illustrated. I hope you dig this. If you do, check out some of the other stuff. As I said, I've done, I just did Dirt Bike Magazine's very first issue. My buddy Bright Smith has the first issue of Motocross Action. That's one of the few ones I don't have, so I'm going to try and score that from him so I can do one for that as well. Might do Super Motocross and some of the other iconic magazines in the industry. Go back, maybe MX Racer and stuff. Let me know if you like this and put a comment below, and maybe I'll make time to do those as well. So check out the channel. I have other reviews of motorcycles, all kinds of motocross related stuff. Give me a subscribe if you would. Ding the bell. If you want to leave me a comment or anything on Twitter or Instagram, the handle is @TonyBlazer. That's TonyBlazier. And you can always help out the channel by buying some merchandise or something, some Motocross Vault stuff in the little tray in the comment section below. And until we meet again, keep the rubber side down. Peace.